Hello everyone, this is Zut. Today we'll talk about residual risk assessment. What we start with is an inherent risk assessment. Inherent risk is the initial risk of a hazard before any risk measures are implemented. And the risk level remains unchanged because it reflects the nature of the hazard itself. And the purpose of assessing inherent risk is to identify the priority risks. As through this assessment, we can understand the risk level of each hazard, and those rated as high risks and extreme high risks are our key focus that require stronger control measures. And once control measures are in place, we can assess the residual risk, which is the risk that remains after control measures have been implemented. And residual risk is dynamic. It can change over time. This is because control measures can fail or become less effective. As the controls fail or weaken, the residual risk will increase. So, for example, let's say if all control measures fail, so it's basically the same as having no controls at all. So the residual risk level becomes equal to the level of inherent risk. And the reason why we assess the residual risk is to determine whether the risk have been reduced to an acceptable level. So how low does the risk need to be considered acceptable? I found the definition of acceptable risk in this chemical standard. So the acceptable risk includes low risks as well as medium risks that meet the ALARP principle, that is as low as reasonably possible. So low risks are considered fully acceptable as the risk level is already the lowest. And medium risks can also be acceptable as long as a LARP is achieved. So this means that all reasonable and practical control measures have been implemented. We've done everything we reasonably can, but the risk level remains medium. So in this case, it is considered acceptable. And in general, our goal is to reduce extremely high risk, and even medium risk down to low risk levels. Or at a minimum, risk should be reduced to medium and meet a log. So if a risk remains high, it is not acceptable, and further control measures must be implemented to bring the risk level down. The methods for assessing residual risk is the same as for inherent risk. In other words, whatever method we use for the inherent risk, we continue to use that same one. For example, if we use a fine Kinney method or LEC method for risk assessment, we'll see that after implementing control measures, the scores will decrease. Let's look at how this works. For first, likelihood. A likelihood is usually related with engineering controls. So when we implement control measures, engineering controls such as machine guards or light curtains, so the likelihood of an incident decreases. This is because the probability of workers being exposed to the hazard is reduced. Workers, they are separated from the hazards by those control measures, by those engineering controls. For example, if the original inherent risk had a likelihood score of 6, quite possible, or 3, unusual but possible, and we reduce it to 1, then the overall risk value drops to 1/6 or 1/3 of the original. So this can significantly reduce a high risk to a medium one or even a low risk. And second, exposure frequency. So this factor is usually more difficult to reduce because in most cases, workers are exposed during their daily tasks. So it's not realistic to reduce exposure from daily to weekly or monthly. But there are some cases like a very particularly dangerous tasks. We can rotate workers instead of assigning the same person every day. So this is a case that using an administrative control measure that help reduce exposure frequency. And finally, consequences. Some control measures can reduce the consequences. For example, uh, in some inflammable or explosive areas that can lead to multiple fatalities, we can use administrative control measures like limiting the number of workers in those areas to reduce the number of potential casualties. And wearing PPE can also reduce severity. For example, wearing a hard hat will result in a less severe injury compared to not wearing one. So, in summary, these factors are closely related to the type of control measures we implement. Engineering controls mainly reduce likelihood. Administrative controls can reduce exposure frequency and sometimes consequences. And PPE mainly reduces the severity of consequences. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for listening. See you next time.